Hello and welcome to Viral Shakespeare. This is Dr. Rusty Jones. I'm making these series of videos while we are basically being quarantined because of the coronavirus. These are for my Murray State English Literature Shakespeare students, but I thought I would post them publicly on YouTube because what the heck, maybe we all need a little Shakespeare at this time. So, for my Murray State students, I'm going to pick up where I left off last Friday before I got sent to my home and my lovely brown background and all of that. We were talking about Henry V. I had introduced it to you, and so today, for the next half hour, I'm going to talk about the first act of Henry V, and I hope everybody enjoys it. For my students, you will be tested on it once we get back from spring break. So today, we have Henry V by Will Shakespeare, Act 1, or, some of Act 1, 30 minutes worth, as much as I can get around to. Okay. So, for the Murray State students, if you could open up the PowerPoint slides that I put on Canvas, the ones that I introduced to you last time, there's just a couple of last points I want to make before I move into the prologue and Act 1 of Henry V. So, I was talking about history plays. The very first slide, make sure you've got it open, please. If you need to pause me, go ahead. So, I'll wait while you open it up. So, pause me now. Okay, good. Now that I'm unpaused, oh my goodness, I touched my face. Well. So, now that I'm unpaused, in the very first slide, I don't really want to reiterate anything from the genealogy of English kings and queens that's located there, just to point out that Shakespeare did write a lot about English history. And as I pointed out to you, that is the way that the people got their information about the history of their country, how their political and social systems evolved, etc. And it was a heavily monitored, very popular theatrical genre. It was subject to a lot of scrutiny because it'll influence the ideology of the time, and so when you've got a lot of people learning their history this way, it needs to be closely monitored by the master of the revels, which it was. Some of Shakespeare's plays were censored, which we'll get into in a little bit, but when you're writing history, my point in that first slide was it's a dangerous business. The second slide, one of the main things that I wanted to point out to you is near the bottom of the slide, and it is the idea that Shakespeare's history plays were viewed analogically. You see the word down there, analogically. And what that means is, not allegorically, but analogically, that people would make connections between famous people in history and people in their own time period. We kind of do the same thing to some extent today when we watch a history, but they certainly did it back then. The example that I gave you in class is of the Essex Rebellion of 1601. So that's dealt with just a little bit on the slides, but just for everybody else as a brief overview. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was sent off to Ireland in 1599 by Queen Elizabeth to squash the Irish Rebellion under the Earl of Tyrone. Well, things didn't go well for Essex. The Irish fought a guerrilla-style war, the English did not, and Essex was forced into an armistice. Basically, he had to sign a kind of ceasefire with the Irish, and he had to come back to Elizabeth in 1600 and explain that he did not do what she wanted him to do, which was to completely destroy the Irish Rebellion. Instead, he made peace with them. She put him on trial. She removed him from a lot of his public offices. He was basically shamed and disgraced. And after that, the Earl of Essex began to foment a rebellion against Elizabeth. And in 1601, that's exactly what he did. He tried to forcibly remove Queen Elizabeth I from the throne. Now, before he tried to do that, we have some information that suggests that he hired Shakespeare's company to put on not Henry V, but another history play, Richard II. And in Richard II, the fourth act basically involves how you remove a monarch. Henry IV in that play makes an argument for the removal of Richard II, and in fact, Richard is removed and he is imprisoned in that play. We also have some evidence that that fourth act was censored. It was not present in productions of Richard II, possibly while Elizabeth was still alive. But when it was commissioned by Essex, very likely the fourth act with the deposition scene was put back in to try to make a kind of analogical argument. Henry IV equals the Earl of Essex, the person we should be rooting for. Queen Elizabeth equals the despotic Richard II, the person that we want thrown out. well, it didn't quite work out. Essex didn't get the followers that he wanted. He was captured. He was put on trial. This is all in 1601, and he is now executed by Elizabeth I. So this is the point that I wanted to make about history plays in Shakespeare's day being read by the populace analogically, which makes them additionally dangerous and requiring the scrutiny of Edmund Tilney, the master of the revels. In fact, we also have some evidence that Shakespeare's Henry V, so back to Henry V, was itself censored. All the chorus speeches seem to have been cut. Also, the very first bishop scene, Act 1, Scene 1, very likely that that was cut too. And the Irish character of Macmorris, because we can't show a play around 1599, early 1600, when Henry V was likely produced, that shows a kind of happy union between soldiers, in particular Irish soldiers, Welsh, Scots, English, etc., all fighting against the French in Henry V. We don't want to show that, so the Irish soldier had to go. After Elizabeth's death, it seems likely that these things came back in. The chorus speeches, Act 1, Scene 1 with the bishops, and the Irish character of Macmorris. But during the whole Irish Rebellion phase, 1599, 1600s, thereabouts, this was too politically explosive. So those characters, those scenes, all cut. All cut. So the other thing from the slide, the very last thing that I wanted to point out to you, is I want you all please to remember that Henry V is the last in a sequence, the last in the tetralogy. It's the second historical tetralogy that Shakespeare wrote. The sequence was composed and performed between 1595 and 1599, thereabouts. They consist of Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. The first historical tetralogy, which was written before the Henry V sequence, but historically takes place after, consists of Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. That sequence was composed and first performed between 1590 and 1593, thereabouts. I encourage you to think about them, or think about the Henry V sequence as a prequel, like the Star Wars prequels. And I think on the slides I mentioned that that would make Henry V, if you look at it that way, as Revenge of the Sith, but that's not a great comparison there. Maybe because Henry V ends so happily, we should compare it instead to something like Return of the Jedi before we got to the next sequence, the more recent sequence, the Daisy Ridley sequence of Star Wars trilogy films. The difference here is that if at the happy ending of Return of the Jedi, Ghost Yoda or Force Ghost Yoda had stepped forward and said, yeah, this is all wonderful, this is all well and good and happy and all that, Luke, but you know the First Order is going to rise and we're going to lose all of this and everything's going to suck, right? And the movie would end with a resounding thud. And the same thing is true with Henry V. Henry has won in France, spoiler alert, sorry. He's going to marry Catherine, everything seems very, very positive, and the chorus steps out at the end and says the following. Henry VI, in infant bands crowned King of France and England, did this king succeed, whose state so many had the managing that they lost France, and made his England bleed, which oft our stage hath shown. And for their sake, in your fair minds, let this acceptance take. Clunk. All of that happiness about one of the greatest military victories that England had ever seen ends with that kind of thud. Oh yeah, by the way, all this wonderful stuff that we got under Henry V is going to be lost. So, sorry. But you, the audience, knew that already because you've seen this sequence of plays before. Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. So you already knew that anyway. But just a reminder, this isn't going to go particularly well. That's all I wanted to point out as far as the slides are concerned. So I'm going to take those slides down over here. And I'm going to just go ahead and open the play itself. So everybody has your textbooks, I hope? You at home, watching on YouTube, if you don't have a Henry V textbook, there's lots of online versions of the play that you can find. So go ahead and check it out. And I wanted to start with the prologue itself. And I argued with you, class, that Shakespeare's theater is presentational rather than representational. If it's representational and you need a forest, you bring in a forest backdrop. If you need a castle, you bring in fake castle walls. In a presentational form of theater, you just walk out into the middle of the stage and you go, this is the Forest of Arden. And everyone goes, okay, got it. This is the Forest of Arden. Bingo. Oh, what a pleasant seat is your castle, basically, is said in Macbeth. And everyone goes, okay, we're in Castle Macbeth. I gotcha. The opening of Henry V, the very long choral speech at the beginning, makes a very presentational argument. It's also a very apologetic argument, saying, look, I'm going to show you some of the most important things that ever happened in English history. One of our greatest victories over the French at Agincourt, and I'm going to do a terrible job because I don't have the facilities to make it as noble as it is. So let your imagination work on this. Let it make it as noble and important as possible. So it's both an appeal to the imagination and a kind of an apology. We're not trying to make English history look bad. It's just this is the resources. This is all we've got. So this is the best that we can do. So the prologue comes out, and I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll backpedal on it a little bit. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds should famine, sword and fire crouch for employment. But pardon, gentles all the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that did affright the air in Agincourt? Oh, pardon. Since a crooked figure may attest in little place 1,000,000, then let us, ciphers to this great account, on your imaginary forces work. Suppose, within the girdle of these walls are now confined 2 mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man, and grant imaginary puissance. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hooves in the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishments of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me, chorus to this history, who, prologue-like, your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. Now that's it. And I'm going to go back through and just touch on a couple of points that I just made. Oh, for a muse of fire. Oh, in Shakespeare, remember, is either this sign of despair and exasperation, or I really want something. I wish I had something. Oh, for a muse of fire. Gosh, I wish I had a muse that was made out of fire that could make this subject absolutely as worthy as it should be. I wish I had a kingdom for a stage, princes to act. I wish I had monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then Harry himself would show up, as he should, but I don't have any of that stuff. Pardon, gentles all. The flat unraised spirits, that's us actors. He calls the globe a cockpit. He calls it a wooden O. He derides it as this empty and almost meaningless excuse for a location for such great events. Then he says a crooked figure, a little comma, if you put it in the right spot, it can make 1,000,000 out of just a few little ciphers. So, since we only have a couple of people to do this, let your imagination multiply us. We've got one man to be a soldier. Make that man 1,000. We don't have any horses. Imagine that when we talk about them, that you see them. Imagine that this side of the stage is France, and that this side of the stage is England, and that the perilous narrow ocean parts the two asunder. We need your imagination to do this, because we don't have any of it. So go ahead and help us out with this. And he says he's going to act as a kind of Greek chorus to all of these fantastic events, just elevating their importance all the more. And he says, please, 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 judge us gently, patiently, kindly, all the rest of it. In other words, we don't want to get in trouble for all of this. Okay, let me check the time here. Still doing okay. Act 1, Scene 1. Probably cut when Elizabeth was still alive. Why do you think that it was cut? Well, these two bishops are discussing how to get Henry to attack France. The scene potentially puts the whole war with France into a very bad light because they're being very manipulative over money matters. And if you read this analogically, you could apply it to Elizabeth's court. Remember that I mentioned to you that Henry is a descendant, or Elizabeth is a descendant of Henry's. And so anything bad that you say about Henry, you also say about Elizabeth, and that's pretty dangerous. So you got to be careful with a scene like this, which is why it was probably cut. But you've got two bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Ely, coming in at this scene. And for those of my students on Canvas, I will put some links to some good YouTube videos from the Kenneth Branagh film version. If you're just watching this on YouTube, watch the Kenneth Branagh film version of Henry V. It's terrific. I also like The Hollow Crown with Tom Hiddleston as Henry V. That's also terrific. If you're looking for something to do during this plague time, watch those. They're tremendous. Canterbury says at the very beginning, "My lord, I'll tell you that self-bill is urged, which in the 11th year of the last king's reign was like, and had indeed against us passed, but that the scambling and unquiet time did push it out of farther question." Translated for you. If we were in class, I would ask you to put that into your own words, but what it basically means is, back in the reign of Henry IV, around the year 1410, a bill was pushed through Parliament that basically would have affected the church financially in a terrible way. Well, that bill is back again under Henry V, and we've got to do something about it. And Ely says, "But how, my lord, shall we resist it now? It must be thought on," says Canterbury. We got to think about that. "If it passed against us," that's the bill, "we lose the better half of our possession. We lose more than half of the church's entire holdings. For all the temporal lands which men devout by testament have given to the church, would they strip from us? The crown will take all of our holdings. Being valued thus," and then we get a long valuation of exactly how much the crown would take from the church. This would be ruinous to them. And so Canterbury and Ely need to act, maybe not in the best interest of England, but certainly in their own financial interest to try to defeat this bill. You can see why this was probably cut. This bill, says Ely at about line 20, would drink deep. Canterbury says would drink the cup and all. It would take everything. "But what prevention?" says Ely. "How do we stop it? The king is full of grace and fair regard." That's not an answer. So how do we stop this bill? Well, the king is full of grace and fair regard. It's a way of saying, he really likes the church and he's kind of a holy guy now. So why don't we push him a little bit in that area? And that's exactly what they're going to do, because Ely says, "and a true lover of the holy church." Think about that. "The courses of his youth promised it not." Now we get backstory. For the audience that has seen the whole Henry IV sequence, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, they know Henry V as Hal. Hal, or Prince Hal, is the ne'er-do-well prince, drinking and playing tricks and fighting and hanging out with Falstaff and Bardolph and Nym and all those folks. And he hasn't been the most upstanding person in the entire world, and his father, Henry IV, has called him on the carpet for this before. But now, when we reach Henry V, he is a new being, a holy being, a being who's capable of defeating France. He's had a kind of religious conversion after he threw off Bardolph and Falstaff and all the rest of them at the end of Henry IV Part 2. "Yea, at the very moment," says Canterbury, "consideration like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise to envelop and contain celestial spirits." Later, at about line 60 or so, Ely compares his situation to a strawberry that grows underneath a nettle, which is a nasty pointy plant, saying all we needed to do was to remove that nasty nettle that was Prince Hal, and then we would reveal the holy strawberry beneath, and that's Henry V. He literally has been remade. He's been converted into this holy being. He was a ne'er-do-well, he was a drinker, he was a partier, etc. But Canterbury says now that he's had this conversion at line 43, "List," or listen, "his discourse of war, and you shall hear a fearful battle rendered you in music. Turn him to any cause of policy, the Gordian knot of it he will unloose, familiar as his garter. That when he speaks the air, a chartered libertine, is still, and the mute wonder lurketh in men's ears to steal his sweet and honeyed sentences." So he's literally become almost like a godlike figure. Later, at about line 69 or so, Ely says, "But my good lord, how now for mitigation of this bill? We've done our bit, we've praised Henry enough, which hopefully will make Elizabeth happy. But my good lord, how now for mitigation of this bill urged by the Commons? Doth his majesty incline to it or no? Does he want to take our money or not? He seems indifferent, says Canterbury, or rather swaying more upon our part than cherishing the exhibitors against us. For I have made an offer to his majesty upon our spiritual convocation, and in regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to his grace at large, as touching France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did to his predecessors part withal, meaning, I've touched the idea of France with him and said, if you go and invade France, in fact, you'll make more money than you can possibly imagine, much more than you'd get from the church. So that's what he's done. He's opened up this idea of France in Henry's mind. Jumping ahead to Act 1, Scene 2, and let me check on my time. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to restrict this to 30 minutes, as I'm going to try to do each and every time I make one of these videos for you all. Act 1, Scene 2, the king enters and asks, "Where is my gracious Lord of Canterbury? Not here in presence. Send for him, my good uncle." So we're going to bring them in to discuss this situation that's now been introduced to us, this whole idea of invading France. The king says, once the bishops enter, this is at about line 10, he asks both bishops to justly and religiously unfold why the law Salic that they have in France or should not bar us in our claim. That takes a little bit of untangling, so let me go through that. Henry's asking of the bishops, he asked them to justly and religiously tell him whether or not he has a claim, a legitimate claim, to go into France and take it over. Justly and religiously, I want you to think about that for a second. He wants, if he takes over France, he wants it to be just and he wants it to be religious. He wants it to be legally right. He wants it to be morally right. He doesn't want anything that anyone could throw back at him and saying either you're a tyrant or you're a monster or you're a demon or whatever it is, justly and religiously. And he's going to point the same thing out a little bit later at about line 95 or so, 96, where the king says, "May I with right and conscience make this claim to France." Right and conscience. Again, morally, legally, can I make the case that I am on the up and up here, I am in the right. Otherwise, I don't really want to do it. That's the kind of person that he is. He also warns Canterbury not to lie and not to make too much of anything because so many people are going to die, which tells you something else about Henry's character. I'll come back to the Salic law in a little bit, but I want to read just a section of the warning to Canterbury here at line 21. Act 1, Scene 2, line 21. "Therefore take heed, says Henry V, how you impawn our person, how you awake our sleeping sword of war. We charge you, in the name of God, take heed, for never to such kingdoms did contend without much fall of blood, whose guiltless drops are every one a woe. A sore complaint against him whose wrongs gives edge under the swords that makes such waste in brief mortality. Under this conjuration speak, my lord." So be careful. Lots of people are going to die if you lie, and he makes that very, very clear. Canterbury then says, fine, I will respond to your concerns about the Salic law. He says, you have a concern about the Salic law. And he says, fine, let me explain the Salic law to you. And so he does. And he says this. "Interum salicam mulieris ne succedant." Act 1, Scene 2, line 38. So your Latin's pretty good, so I don't think I need to explain that. So let's just move on. Oh, it's not good? Okay. The next line explains it. "No woman shall succeed in Salic land." That's what it means. The Latin, the English. No woman shall succeed in Salic land. The bishop then goes on to make the argument that the French say that the Salic land is France, and because Henry's claim to France derives from his maternal line, he has no claim because of the Salic law. He cannot invade France, since you have the law that says, no woman shall succeed in Salic land. Henry, you are derived, or your French claim is derived from your female side of your family, therefore, sorry, you can't have it. But Canterbury says, none of it's true. He says, the Salic land is not France. The Salic land is Germany. Therefore, the law doesn't even apply. And then, my goodness, he goes on an extensive, very, very extensive genealogical explanation of how, essentially, all of the French kings to this time, as he says at line 89, hold in right and title of the female. So do the kings of France unto this day. So he says, even if the Salic land is in France, which it's not, it's in Germany, all the French kings are descended from the female, so this also applies to them, so don't worry about it. He also calls his long genealogical explanation as clear as is the summer's sun at line 86, which should be a laugh line because it's not clear at all. Not in the slightest. And that's when Henry returns to the idea of, fine, okay, you've given me all these explanations. I just want to know, can I do it legally? Can I do it morally? With right and conscience make this claim. And Canterbury says, the sin upon my head, dread sovereign, and then goes into a biblical explanation. So he says, yes, you absolutely can. Exeter says that your brother kings, he says this to Henry V, and monarchs of the earth do all expect that you should rouse yourself, as did the former lions of your blood. Probably referring to his ancestor, the Black Prince, who had many, many military victories while abroad. Edward III, the Black Prince's father, is another one who had quite a number of military victories, and Henry traces his line back to them. Therefore, there's also a kind of hereditary expectation that he will go and kick some butt in France. Henry then feels himself resolved, both legally and morally, to go ahead and make the claim to France, and so he calls in the French ambassador, known as the Dauphin, and the Dauphin, however you pronounce it, I think I'm going to go with Dauphin, enters Act 1, Scene 2, about line 245. Let me check on my time. I've got 3 minutes left. And says basically, you have sent into France and you claimed some certain dukedoms, about line 248, in the right of your great predecessor, King Edward III, in answer of which claim the Prince our master says that you savor too much of your youth. Reminds him of the fact that he was Prince Hal. You savor too much of your youth and bids you be advised. There's naught in France that can be with a nimble galliard won. In other words, your wonderful dancing you used to do at the bars won't help you to the dukedoms that you're claiming in France. Ha ha, get lost. And the French send Henry a gift. If we were in class together, I'd ask you what it is, but it's pretty direct. It's tennis balls. That could be read any number of ways. The way I like to read them is, one, it's a reminder of his, shall we say, dissolute youth, when he was just playing around with Falstaff and others, playing tennis, drinking, swearing, hanging out with prostitutes, etc. But I also like the idea that he's saying to Henry, basically, here are your balls, and we've got them. You don't have the balls to come take on France. Fine. Henry is justly upset at this. But maybe, and I leave this to you to think about, my class and the people watching on YouTube, is he overreacting? Because he imagines himself like a Jove, or an Old Testament God coming to sweep everybody away for the indignity that he has suffered. And I'm about done with Act 1 here. Line 279, Act 1, Scene 2. But I will rise there, France, with so full a glory that I will dazzle all the eyes of France, yea, strike the Dauphin blind to look on us, and tell the pleasant prince this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones, and his soul shall stand sore charged for the wasteful vengeance that shall fly with them. For many a thousand widows shall this his mock out of their dear husbands, mock mothers from their sons, mock castles down, and some are yet ungotten and unborn that shall have cause to curse the Dauphin's scorn. But this lies all within the will of God, to whom I do appeal, and in whose name tell you the Dauphin, I am coming on, to venge me as I may, and to put forth my rightful hand in a well-hallowed cause. So not only will all of you regret this insult from the Dauphin, people who aren't even born yet will regret this insult from the Dauphin. Is this righteous behavior? Is this legal behavior? Or is this Hal, good old Prince Hal, having his personal little feelings hurt and coming in to exact what he calls revenge on France for the insult? I leave that for you to think about. More soon.